of today's conversation is to make sure that men in particular, men working in the higher education sector, they have got a voice, they have a place to be able to talk about their challenges, to be able to talk in safe spaces. And what research tells us basically is that it's not common. As we focus on men this month, we can't ignore the fact that men tend to be more reluctant to seek help or treatment for their mental health struggles. And when compared with women, men are almost half as likely to report professional help or to seek professional help. This is all this conversation is about today. The conversation today is about raising awareness about men's mental health, creating safe spaces for men to be able to talk about the challenges they face, particularly as fathers, as carers, but also as men in their own right. To be able to share the lived experience of normalizing seeking support, what that means like, and then to discuss how universities and workplaces they can better support men's mental health and well-being through equality charters and other institutional strategies as well. Like I said, this session is going to be 60 minutes long. It is being recorded right now. You will all receive a copy of the session. Over 200 people have registered for this event, and I'm so grateful that there is such a lot of interest. And what I know that a lot of people, in response to this event, they have reached out to come to me with further ideas about how important they feel this area is and how much of support is needed really in this area. So big thanks to those who have already engaged with me, and I have your emails. I'll come back to you. Could I quickly just remind everybody again that this is a safe space for everyone? I will now invite my panelists I will ask them questions, they will respond, and I will request them again to A, introduce themselves, and then B, to stick to the timeline, because like I said, we have a packed agenda and there's a lot of conversation going on. And with a massive advance thanks to my first speaker, Dr. Mark Gatto. And my first question to you is really, tell us about your own experiences of being a carer or being a father and how that relates to your own mental health. What are some of the challenges or some of the benefits that being a carer or being a father, they bring to your daily life? Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Madiha, and it's a real pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists talking about such an important topic. And I'm hoping that I can share some of my lived experiences of being a carer of my two children. I'm currently on shared parental leave and have been since late July and will finish in January, so quite a significant length of time. And I'm looking after my daughter primarily, who's 9 months old now. And so today I'm going to talk to you a bit about my experiences with time as the theme I'm going to talk about to address this topic. And I'll just talk you through that now. It's 3 a.m. and I jolt awake to the unmistakable sound of my daughter's cry. Adrenaline surges through my body as her moan slowly escalates. I enter the 5 stages of grief for the sleep I'm about to lose. First, I deny that she is really unsettled and wait for her to go back to sleep. Then, I feel anger that my sleep has been disturbed, particularly that it is now my sole responsibility to resolve this. I bargain with myself to wait just a little longer to see if she miraculously settles down by herself. Then I succumb to depression as I look at my watch one more time and determine how long it might take before I can try to get back to sleep. Finally, I accept my lead care responsibility and leave the cocoon of my duvet to confront the midnight chill and the beginning of the resettle baby routine. As a father taking the lead carer role on shared parental leave, it is my responsibility to care for my daughter and enable my wife's return to work. I felt constantly guilty early on as I started to take on this responsibility, as my daughter was still highly dependent on breast milk. She was solely breastfed at that point, and we had hoped that she would be weaned a bit earlier than she was. But obviously babies don't play by these rules and these expectations can be dashed. So this meant I was not in control of my time and I was not able to protect my wife's time. Over the space of the last 3 months, 3.5 months, my relationship with time has become increasingly complex. So I'm going to talk about a few themes of time to kind of give you a flavour of this. The first theme is family time. Time is shared in a family. There is chaotic family time, interdependent co-parent time, relationship time, focused carer time, and the rarity of me time. The shared nature of time means that my experience of parental leave and mental health is entwined with the experiences of my wife, Holly, and our children as well. We have survived a range of challenges since our daughter was born to make our family a 4. As a father, I have felt the pressure to maintain a level head when breastfeeding hormones became acutely volatile for my wife. Balancing my needs with those of my wife has been really hard at times, particularly when we have been sleep deprived. It has been hardest when our children have picked up viruses or had accidents. In the last few weeks, we have visited A&E twice, and my emotional energy is almost spent, I must admit. Sitting in those waiting rooms for 3, 4, 5 hours with an agitated 3-year-old is often not very pleasant. Amidst such challenging times, there are moments of joy when we are together as a family, when out, or when children are playing together, and when my wife and I chat and decompress at the end of the day. My time is shared with my family, and I'm here today because my wife supports my career identity, and talking about this topic was so important to me. So that brings us on to career time. As an academic who does research connected to parents in paid work and masculinities, I felt the pressure to maintain my career identity throughout my time on parental leave, mainly due to the fortunate gift of my daughter's afternoon nap. However, there is often not enough time to achieve what I would like, and I feel anxiety rise when I am interrupted trying to squeeze a bit of research, reading or writing into that short afternoon nap time. Yet time is frustratingly slow and stretches out endlessly when I am sat watching Paw Patrol with my son, or rereading one of our many Lift the Flap books to my daughter, which I now know off by heart. Which brings us on to the theme of slow time. Time can feel torturously slow when I'm feeling exhausted and surviving the day. At those times, I feel so guilty that I'm not relishing the present caregiving with my daughter. I chastise myself for flicking through my Twitter feed, well, although now Mastodon tweet, while she is distracted and my mind slips between ideation of the future and memories of the time. Being on parental leave offers the gift of time for reflecting and thinking, but also the curse of time when days drag or sleep time is lost. Sleeplessness often exacerbates feeling of tension and reduces my resilience to stresses, like a moody 3.5-year-old. When I notice feelings of anger rising in me, a consequence of unspent energy during long hours of childcare, I try to carve out me time to do the things that help me relax, such as reading or going for a short run. I'm always conscious of maintaining my mental health, but finding consistent me time is very challenging, especially time to exercise, to leave the house when children are getting tired as well. This brings us on to social time. Social time, being a father and trying to socialize can feel uncomfortable and sometimes lonely. One experience that I wanted to embrace while I was on parental leave was attending baby classes. I knew I would be one of the odd ones out, and have experienced the loneliness of crowds on more than one occasion. I often find myself in those times of feeling a bit isolated, intensely focused on the time with my daughter instead, and that distracts me from the awkwardness of stifled adult interactions. On other occasions, I've had lovely conversations with a friendly mother and also a really nice father who I also started to get to know. I was disappointed last week, in fact, when I realised that neither the mother or the father were there, and wondered if they would return, because children get older and classes change. Thinking back to the first time I went to a baby class, I was very nervous to enter the class and strangely surprised at how relieved I was to see another father there amongst many mothers, as this is often a space where women are the dominant group, primarily as a consequence of the structures of this country in childcare. It is my hope that more fathers will consider or be able to attend these baby classes to find social connection as parents and to have those human interactions that I've had in these classes that have been the bright sparks in some of my parental leave. And so the final thoughts I'm going to share with you just relate to counting and cuddling time. So one of the ways I cope with the long stretches of resettling my daughter in the middle of the night is rocking her back to sleep. And the psychological trick I use is counting down from 100. I initially started doing this with my now 3.5-year-old son, as he was very difficult to settle at night time. I returned to this method with my daughter as a way of protecting my mental health overnight. So as I stand in the dark silence, rocking my 9-month-old daughter, the count sometimes get to 300, 350, and include sets of deep rocking, gentle rocking, swaying, stationary vigils over her cot. It is during these sequences of rocking and counting that I sometimes enter into a blissful sense of presence. As all the other thoughts melt away, I cuddle my daughter and rock and count. These are the times that I treasure and will remember in the future when I am not relishing the present. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mark. I'm trying to find the clap button. There we go. I found that. I think it's just so heartfelt and this is so honest. And this actually brings home the reality. You've touched on so many important elements here, the lack of sleep, the constant fatigue, how that creeps into your work time, the me time, being the father, being the figurehead as well. I think that's really great and such an honest and such an artful way of putting your thoughts into words, if I may. We will come back to your thoughts in a minute. I will now move on to my next speaker, Matteo Fumagalli from UCL. Matteo, please do introduce yourself. And I have a similar question for you, Matteo. What are your experiences of being a carer and or a father? And then how easy it is to find formal or informal support at workplace, whether that means within your networks, whether that means HR policies. How do you navigate that space? Over to you, Matteo.
Thank you. Thank you, Madiha. Thank you, Ma, for the beautiful account. I found myself a lot into that also, although it's a distant memory for me at the moment. I prepared a few slides with pictures mainly to accompany my talk. So I'll put them on screen now. So yeah, I'm Matteo Fumagalli. I work at UCL as a teaching and learning manager. So I'm professional services. I fall into that category. And my own experience of fatherhood is, well, I have two children. I have Leon, who is coming up to 10 now, and Sami, who is coming up to 8. and sorry, no, Leon is 10 already. Leon is 10 already. And you see them here in a picture of quite a few years ago. And I had them at two different universities, and I'll go back to why I'm mentioning this in a minute. But probably it's worth starting by saying that I wanted children. So it's something that I felt since I was a young man. I wanted to have a family, and both children were planned. So in a sense, things were relatively easier because I kind of chose the path. And I love seeing them grow and change and transform and so on. And I absolutely treasure the fact that I'm there to support them in this process together with my wife Svetlana. We drive like a close partnership in this. So for me, the experience throughout the past 10 years of fatherhood has been a demanding experience. I found it demanding generally to lead a busy professional life, do fatherhood, do husbandhood, and nurture my own interest and friendships and slip in a bit of sport from time to time as well. So it's a difficult balancing act, but in the long run seems to be working. So I feel most of the time not being able to to balance things. But if I look at the long run, is actually working, because all these areas of my life I actually get nurtured from time to time. So as I mentioned earlier, I had Leon and Sami at different universities. So Leon was born in 2012, and I was at the LSE at that time. And Sami was born when I just joined UCL. So I had kind of exposure to different types of different sets of policies. And preparing this talk, I looked at what the policies are at UCL at the moment, and I was actually surprised because there's 9 separate policies specific to parenting at the moment, and they weren't there when I accessed them back then. And so I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised. And so it means that the university and the culture is is moving towards a more supportive way of managing parenthood for staff, which is positive for sure. So these are the kind of 9 formal policies I found, but also there's more informal things or different things. One is this flexible and compressed hours policy, which I took advantage of in case of both children, because my wife went back to work part-time. So what I did, I was working my hours like in less days when the children were small. And this was like invaluable time, really, because I managed, I think, to build a bond with them when they were really young, on a one-to-one, which I'm really grateful for. And the other thing, I was able to understand a bit more, the challenge of a parent being alone at home with their own child, managing sleep times together with light housework and meals and self-care and so on. So that was good. I've actually had very supportive colleagues as well. So they were working flexibly as well as a result of me choosing compressed hours. Then I took advantage when I was at the LSE of this mentoring program there for dads. So I was put in touch with an existing dad, someone who had already 2 or 3 children, I think, and it was really nice having chats over coffee about how what my worries were, practical tips and all that. And when I joined UCL, I think I joined almost immediately the Parents and Carers Together network, and that was another really priceless source of support, because Madiha and the other organizers put together any sort of sessions from managing challenging behaviors to multilingualism in children and all that. So it was really, really good. Because I managed to meet a lot of other parents in the university as a side effect of it. And then only a couple of years ago, I joined the local dads group. So it's not university dads, it's just dads who live locally. And basically what we do, we go out once a month for a few drinks and have a night together. Sometimes it's 5 of us, sometimes it's 20. Sometimes we go for a concert together. But it's nice to have the kind of network where to share, practical tips as well as yeah, I guess getting to know local people who are there attend. So my own experience has been very varied, especially during the past few years due to COVID and lockdowns. But what I can report back has been that looking after my own mental health is so important. It's really so important to keep things ticking along at home and at work, and being able, to be in a good space myself allows me to actually give properly to these areas of my life and to my children especially. Another thing I learned is that most parents go through similar struggles. So as dads, probably we live more in a bit of a cocoon in the first year because we're not exposed to NCT groups necessarily or things like that as do mothers or breastfeeding groups, for example. So yeah, we basically need to create occasions to talk. They don't just come to us so naturally. Another thing I accessed was counseling services within the university. So I advise students every day to access support services within the university. And when things weren't particularly happy for me, I did access this myself, and I was actually surprised because it was so helpful to have someone independent, not judgmental, to just to vent things off or to discuss things and receive feedback. And lessons learned, probably, and not to leave it close to breaking point, but to actually shout for help before that, and generally to talk with people, to connect with people. It could be my wife, could be my sister, could be other dads, could be colleagues, anyone, but really not to suffer in silence, basically, or to have my head filled of doubt or guilt for things, but to to express this to share these feelings. So yeah, so that's basically the end. Basically, I keep going. I don't really have any solutions, even if it's 10 years I'm doing this, but it's a good journey, and I've learned a lot, and I'm enjoying the ride.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matteo. That's again, let me put my clapping hands on. There we go. Fantastic. And I think, again, like Mark, and you've raised some really important points about being able to ask for help and being able to make time for your own self where you feel the belonging, which is essentially the dads group, really. But may I just say full marks to Mark and Matteo for timekeeping. We are sticking to the agenda. I'm really pleased about that. And the chat is live, by the way. So please do feel free to interact, to share your comments, everybody who is listening to us, and to just share best practice, really. So so far we have heard two very personalized accounts about the role of caring as fathers, the role of being the man of the house, really, how you navigate that space between being a carer, being a father, having a professional life, meeting deadlines, making time for yourself. So this is the end user experience, if you like. I would like to turn our attention now towards universities and workplaces that, having heard all of these challenges and knowing the fact that men are less likely to come forward with their support needs, they are less likely to ask for help, they are less reluctant to ask for help. And I know at least a few people on this call today, I can see through the names that there are people I know who'd rather suffer in silence than ask for help, really. So now is the time to turn towards the universities, the strategic planning, and to ask that really, what is the role of universities in supporting the needs of men's mental health, whether those are policies, any processes? And I think that relates to a question that's just popped in the chat about workload, whether that's about establishing networks, any charter marks, how can universities bring it to life? And for this discussion, I have my wonderful speaker, Dr. Arun Verma. Arun, please do introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Madiha, and thanks for the invitation to be here as well. What incredible stories that we've heard so far. And I just want to build on that notion of storytelling. It's so powerful in the role of policy, design, practice, and implementation. It often doesn't really get the recognition it deserves. And I think just doing even just 2 stories today illustrates how little policies really speak to those across the university experience. And wouldn't it be amazing if actually you just had more than 2 stories that would actually shift the policy in a slightly different way to make it a little bit more inclusive? So I just want to talk a little bit about the university structure. So, and then I want to talk a little bit very briefly about intersectionality as well. I think it's really, really important. We recognize that, fathers aren't just fathers, carers aren't just carers. Sometimes you're both. Sometimes you're more than those things, and sometimes your characteristics are more than one. And more often than not, you're not just experiencing one inequality or one slight oppression at a time. That's not the way the world works. It's really messy. It's complicated, and we've already heard stories about tiredness, burnout, fatigue, and stress in a lot of this already. So, in terms of thinking about the ways in which universities support men's mental health and just mental health and well-being more broadly, we need to look a little bit about where mental health services and universities have come from and who they've been designed with, right? So typically, what we see is counselling services designed by mental health practitioners, not often co-produced with the community of service users. And more than than not, we see these kinds of services trying to become more inclusive. So they're trying to undo some of the exclusion that's been part of the design of the counselling service or something more broadly as well. So I think that's really important to recognise that what we're trying to do is in the universities is really recognise how do we transform a service that wasn't necessarily designed for these particular groups. My experience of a mental health service was quite strange in a lot of ways. At the time when I was a student, I was going through a bit of an identity conflict as a gay South Asian man of color. It's quite a strange space to kind of traverse through in a lot of ways. And when I went to a counselling service, I ended up in this informal reverse mentoring role with a counsellor who ended up having to coach them through why I was going through such conflict. And it didn't really kind of make sense to me why I got the great tools for my coping mechanisms and everything, but then I felt like I was giving more than I was able to at the time as well, right? And I think that's a key thing about accessing well-being services. You shouldn't have to be feeling in a way that you're giving more than you need to. You should be there to be getting help in a lot of ways. So if we take the way in which we look at men's mental health across the university system, it's a multi-pronged approach, right? So in the Edita collection I published this year, we looked at the university system in 6 different ways, through the staff lens, the student lens, through teaching, research, governance, and pedagogy, right? Mental health and well-being is something that should traverse through all of those parts of the system. We should be talking about well-being and mental health in our teaching, right? We should be able to be talking about it as part of an intrinsic part of student experience, which I believe it is from a student service perspective. And we also need to be talking about from a staff perspective as well, which I think is really important too. We need to find spaces for men to be able to talk freely and safely about mental health more broadly. And we need to encourage all types of men to be at that conversation as well. I think that's really, really important too. I think we're not just designing a service or men's mental health service for straight men. We're looking at across a range of different types of male identities and masculinity. And I think rethinking that in a lot of ways as well, which I think is really important. So those spaces are really important too. But that can only come when you've got policies in place that protect staff and enable staff and students to have those conversations. how many policies around mental health and well-being have included the voices and stories of people like Mark and Matteo, for example, and others in this space? I don't think there's many in a lot of spaces. And I think that's something that's really powerful for us to be really considerate of. I think one of the other things that policies, processes, and networks can do is create communities of resistance. I say that in ode to bell hooks, right? We're talking about communities of safety where you find compassion with one another. Empowering femininity, the role of relational, the role of talking about feelings is really important. Disempowering masculinity is also important. We need to think about ways to do that through policy making as well, because masculinity hasn't done too well in certain spaces and places. So we need to really kind of find a way to be open to dismantling that as well, deconstructing that in some ways. I think policies and networks can play a role in that in some ways. Now, speaking about charter marks, I think there's an intrinsic nature to both the Themis one and the Race Equality Charter. It's a necessity to be talking about mental health in different forms and well-being. When I was heading up the Race Equality Charter at Advantage, one of the things that I started to deliver was looking at a safeguarding and a trauma-informed practice to those involved in the work of equality and inclusion more broadly. So we need to think about the work that some people are already doing, and I think in this space as well, whether that is a lecturer in STEM or a lecturer in clinical psychology, for example, we need to think about the role of well-being in those particular spaces as well. So what I'm trying to get at is the fact that policies help protect time and ring-fence time to kind of protect and enable staff, students to have these conversations. They set a precedent, and they should do. But it does depend on how well they're implemented, how well they're designed. And I think that's really key as well. And I don't think universities are doing enough to do that. I mean, how many, just as a bit of a provocation here, how many meetings on the Board of Governors or Senate do they talk about men's mental health or mental health and well-being more broadly? How many of our university boards and governors talking about well-being and mental health on an annual general meeting, for example? These are things we want to see kind of infiltrating all parts of the university system. And I think also just kind of as a final point, thinking intersectionally, we also need to be kind of mindful of the role of equality, diversity, and inclusion is intrinsic to mental health and well-being as well, more broadly. Often it's separated, and I think that's really important. We know that inequality leads to poor health outcomes and poor well-being, and we know that exclusion leads to poor health outcomes and well-being as well. So that's why we need to really be thinking and looking more progressively at shared paternity policies. We need to be looking at more gender neutral distributions of policies and care and leave as well, more appropriately. I think there's some universities who are trying to test new approaches, but we're still really far behind, I think, in where the private sector is at the moment as well, and some of the third sector in this space too. So I think we could be learning from other sectors to be a bit more progressive and enabling men to say it's okay to take time off to look after your kids. It's okay to take time off to care. And that's okay, right? And then that's a good thing to do. It's a nice thing to do. We're contributing to society in that way as well. So those are a few kind of provocations and reflections on where I think universities could play more of a role in the mental health and well-being space, but also just kind of sharing a little bit about there's all types of men out there as well, to kind of talk about this too.
Thank you very much, Arun. Here goes my clapping for you. And again, full marks for being on time. I think, again, you raise a really important point about intersectionality. Let's not forgetting that men are not only fathers and carers. There's so many other forms of masculinity as well. And I think I remember somebody speaking to me about fathers and baby loss, something never been done across higher education. You know, a family experiences baby loss. The first question somebody asks is, how's your wife doing, or how's the mother doing? Barely anyone asks, actually, hang on, how's the dad doing? Because the dad is also battling on many fronts with baby loss, not only supporting the family as well as whether it is miscarriage, whether it is an early cot death, whatever that might look like. Thank you very much, Arun, for bringing that to the forefront. And this actually very nicely leads me to the next question I have for Kevin. Kevin, I'll ask you to introduce yourself in a minute. Before I do that, sorry, one quick thing. There are again comments in the chat about going back to the training of managers. That's really important to be able to, for them, that they're able to support and figure out the needs of their staff members, for particularly about their mental health. That's a really critical point, at least for me, the main takeaway. All right, so Kevin, over to you. And my question to you is, how best can universities use this window of opportunity to support men's mental health through strategic planning and through action plans from charter marks. We all know those action plans, multi-page documents. How can we bring those to life? Over to you, Kevin. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Madiha. It's a pleasure to be here. And as a carer of an adult carer, I find events like today really important, just to take stock and reflect on actually how and what we do to make sure that we create a space for us to work that enables us to flourish and to thrive. And I think that's one of the objectives. So building on really what we've heard, I want to say the personal insights are really important, but the responsibility for driving forward change needs to actually lie with institutions. And I say that partly because it's not the responsibility of individual staff members to take that ownership necessarily. It can be rewarded as part of people's work, and I say that as an EDI practitioner. But I think part and parcel of what we need to be thinking about is how do we systemize and structure the responses that we have. So charters and intersectionality and the Athena Swan, building on what Arun was just talking about, are actually highly important. And it's important to reflect that actually what we start with in terms of it becomes much more complicated. So there are lots of charters in higher education that are relevant to the sector. There are some which focus on gender, race, researchers. Mindful Employers is one which is specifically targeting employment and mental health. And we have the Stonewall Diversity Champions. But the important part is about looking at structured frameworks to address equalities issues, because the point, Madiha, that you just draw on, it isn't just about an individual experience or an individual manager. It's also about how we structure the way that we work. It reflects, and it's important to think about the nature of the workplace in the context of the pandemic, changing life cycles in terms of parenting, looking after elderly relatives, but also as we age ourselves. So our needs of the workplace have changed. And it's important from a university perspective that we reflect on this, because staffing is, in higher education, our biggest single cost. So there were reviews about this. There are between 60 and 2/3 of our expenditure in higher education is on staff costs. So if staff aren't able to flourish or thrive, there's a problem. So why charters? Well, charters kind of give us a framework. They allow us to enable benchmarking against criteria. And that provision of comparison allows for both internal, external, and longitudinal comparison. And what we hope is that over time we can drive up better practices. However, it can sometimes feel like charters are used in single dimensions and very simplistically. And Arun has given a clue, but sometimes there's a problem in that. But I also think what they can also do is enable the burden and responsibilities to be shared more equally between individuals who need the change and the support, but also the fact that equalities work is work, and ensuring that organizations actually resource this becomes incumbent as part of the framework if we wish to work and participate in charters. So it's a very systemic response, but actually systems actually enable us to work where it's not our responsibility to help the organization drive or deliver change for us and for everybody else. It's much more, it's looking at it from a top-down, bottom-up approach. I think Arun's point about intersectionality has to be really flagged up. We really need to recognize how complex the lived experiences are, and the fact that we're not just living in an environment where we walk in with one single dimension. I'm a man, but I'm also an Asian man. I'm a gay Asian man. I'm a disabled Asian man. I'm also a carer. And I have all of those identities, and they all come with me to the workplace. How do I adjust to that? And how do I support that? And how do I then work with that? Well, it's not really down to me, but I can help institutions through the work that I do and through chartering to actually systematize that response. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it can allow for us to think about how we do that. I'm going to choose the Athena Swan Charter because it's the one that I've worked with colleagues on previously. And I go back to the picture on the right-hand side. We always need data. And I think data actually can help to allow universities and organizations to think about how proportionate or how challenging or how big the issue is. Now, if you look at the data nationally, mental health issues affect 1 in 4 people. That's what the data suggests. However, if we look at how people report about mental health, it's almost like it's a hidden part of the working environment. We're much better looking at gender because it's much easier to generally identify, and we monitor it more clearly. But mental health reporting is underreported. And so there's a real challenge there. So when we're thinking about a charter like the Athena Swan Charter, we have to think about actually what's in it for men. Well, men make up half the population, but actually they're not just men. They're young men, black men, disabled men, gay men, and men with mental health issues. And so using the charter can be quite a useful way to actually think about how do we systematize an issue and create plans. So Madiha, those action plans can be quite useful. But if you're using data as your starting point, and if you're using internally reported data, there's a risk there that you may not actually have a lot of data to call upon. So what we always recommend is thinking about how do you use your staff surveys and hope that you get disclosure and some information about what your local community needs, how you might use the focus groups that might come from that. But there is data that's beyond the sector. There's, Mind has data on mental health issues. There's lots of reports that talk about the impact and the cost of mental health in the workplace. So thinking about actually what we draw on that. And there's one thing at the bottom, which I think for anybody who's lived through the last few years, which most of us in this room will have, it's thinking about COVID and how universities and organizations have had to navigate some of the very specific challenges that COVID have raised, particularly about well-being and mental health. And there's been a lot of opportunities in terms of opening up conversations and not being shy to have those conversations. So I think it's trying to draw together some of the responses, and universities have been very proactive in surveying. So my own university, my previous university, UCL, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we've been very active and proactive in surveying our staff and our students to find out what their experiences are. And they have actually highlighted some mental health issues. And with the financial cost of living crisis, it's also likely that that's going to also impact on people's mental health and well-being. So it's about trying to think about how do we use the experiences and the knowledge that we have through existing charter work to broaden and deepen, but also to think about how we engage with different communities. I'm going to draw together some of these thoughts and really flag up the need for systemic responses that link together different priorities. And all universities have strategies, they have priorities that they're developing. My institution, we're developing our people and culture strategy for the next 5 years. Well-being and mental health are part of that. But if we're thinking about chartering and how that can work with that, we've got these vehicles that can help drive this work forward. So whether that's around disability, specifically mental health, or whether we take that intersectional perspective through Athena Swan, the Race Equality Charter, or the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index. Whatever framework that we decide to use, how we engage with mental health and how we engage with men's mental health can actually add value to the impact of the work that we're doing as institutions. Like any tool, however, it's only as good as those who approach it and use it to enable them to take that inclusive approach to doing this work. And on that, I think it's time to wrap up and allow for some questions.
Fantastic. You joined the board for full marks, Kevin, for being on time. Thank you very much. Very helpful again. And I think you highlighted the response to COVID-19 as something that has really brought to the forefront the intense need for men's mental health in particular, such as having this conversation. So really, really grateful to have those insights. We are 15 minutes away now. We have heard from 4 wonderful speakers, 2 lived experiences and 2 strategic responses. Now is the time when we open the floor for your comments, your thoughts, any questions. If you would like to, I will try to do this in a very organized way. If you do have a comment or a question, please do raise your hand. I'll call out your name. Then you can unmute yourself. You can put your camera on and we can take it from there. And whilst people are putting together their thoughts, I have one more question for all of my panelists here. And the question is, if there's one piece of advice, there are lots of people on the call today. There are women, there are men, there are managers, there are leaders, there are EDI practitioners, there are HR personnel. We have got representation from all over the country. We have got representatives from Office of Students, from all universities, from funding bodies. One key message that you want people to go away with today, what would that be? Your one key advice. And Mark, you'll have to forgive me for this, but I'll come to you first.
That's okay. I was furiously thinking as you were saying that, I was expecting it would be me first. I would say reaching out and talking to people you trust, widening that network of people you trust.
So reaching out, not holding back, and people,
Yeah,
essentially that goes
open.
back to having that network, that safe space, really. And I guess it doesn't need to be 24 people. It can be 1 or 2 people at work, outside of work, both.
Both, yeah, absolutely. Family, friends, colleagues, because in different contexts you have different challenges. So finding the people who you can resonate with,
Yeah.
have solidarity with, you know, sometimes you just need someone to listen to you. They don't need to come up with the solution, you just need to hear you.
Yeah.
And say it out loud. I think that's, we often as men internalize, I'm as bad as anyone for this. But just keeping it in your head, suffering in silence, try not to do that, because it can just build and build. I think trying to find people who you can share that with.
Sure. And then the worst part of that, Mark, is, and I say that as a woman, is that when a man or a self-identifying man does that, like suffer within themselves, it spills on to others, including the family, including work colleagues, probably. So in many ways, it's better to speak out and speak, not with the whole world, 1 or 2 people, but just to do that exercise. Thank you. Right, we know who is next. Matteo, I'm looking at you. What is your one thing you'd like to say today to everybody on the call today?
I mean, I could openly plagiarize Mark, because that was exactly what I was thinking as a person. The second thing which I discovered during COVID was actually to talk to my children about my own mental health. So to be open about that, because I found it really hard at times. So it was to tell them, look, I know yesterday I was really snappy and so on, but really I'm finding it difficult now.
Yeah.
So for them to have a chance to actually, you know, understand what's going on in my head and in my heart. And of course, it depends on ages. You know, it's different how you do it to a nine months old, to a 2 years old, or a 10 years old. But it's not necessarily something that is bad. You know, it can be actually a good experience for them, because they will go through things like that at some point. So to have their reference adult experiencing the same thing for them, I think is important to make it more normal as their own experience.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think what you do now, you are role modeling for them, right? You are normalizing seeking support. And the more you normalize seeking support or taking a break, the more part of the culture it becomes, really. And that's what I keep telling my daughter. I've got a nearly 18-year-old, and I remind her that there are days when mom needs to back off a bit. There are days when I need some time for myself as a carer, as a parent, and I would like her to do that, if at all, rather than to just stick it up and say, oh no, I can take all the world. I'd rather that she takes a break and accepts that she finds something difficult. Thank you very much. Arun, we're next to you.
Thanks, Madiha. I think just building on what's been said before, I think for me, the one piece of advice is small acts of joy to bring to all parts of this. It doesn't take much just to ask someone in by the water cooler, or if you're on a call, just how they are, and then maybe ask them again how they really are, if you feel comfortable to do that. But I just think those small acts of joy is really important. We can all do that. Those small little bits of kindness can bring the conversation about. So yeah.
That's amazing. I think giving that sort of space and those small actions, really, that make a lot of difference. You never know what the other person is going through. I spoke to a colleague this morning and he was very rushed, and he just said, I'm sorry, I can't commit to that. I'm going through something personal. And all I said was, I hope everything is okay. And the next sentence he said was that his son was going through a severe diagnosis. All it took was for me to ask one question, that I hope everything is okay. Thank you, Arun. Kevin, we are next on to you.
But I think I agree. Aaron and I should have been cloned on this one. I think kindness, but self-kindness, but also kindness to others. Because if you recognize the good in yourself and recognize the good in others, and the fact that most people are, in my mind, fundamentally are very decent, I would always start with that as a premise. And I would always say, sometimes when COVID has been particularly challenging. As a carer stuck at home with an individual who's disabled, it has been a very challenging period when we were in lockdown. So trying to create those openings to actually reach out to friends and to family were very important to me to navigate that, but also to recognize that I can only do so much. And there are limitations for that as well. So as an individual, there's that. In an organizational perspective, it's also to recognize that organizations can change only at a certain pace too. So, whilst I recognize that for myself, I also have to recognize that organization and organizational change can only happen. And there's also capacity in that. So I often say that where we are now is not where we'd like to be, but if we don't allow ourselves to see the possibility for change, then nothing will change. So I have to keep pushing for that, because otherwise, it's not a very positive way forward, to my mind.
Yeah, that makes sense, Kevin. I think comfort zone is a nice place, but it's a place where nothing grows. That's what I like to say. Okay, thank you so much. Two things, please. There is, before I forget, there is my wonderful colleague Katie Barfoot in the audience today, and Katie has shared a message about a research that's taking place, and I will send an email about that too. But please do read the message. I had promised Katie I'll give it a shout out. Katie, watch out for this. Lots of queries coming your way. There's a question from Olivia. Olivia, would you like to please unmute yourself and just say out loud, and we can have a conversation from there?
Sure. Not sure if you can hear me, and sorry for
I'm
a bit sick today. I've been overworked by my kids at the moment. My partner is not here, and so I'm doing a bit more than usual. Yeah, I guess I've got 2 kids under 5, and so it's obviously I'm in the heat of it, and I could definitely sense when I got the first kid and then the second kid even more, how time became really precious in my life. I have limited time to do everything, as Mark was explaining, and quite drastically the amount of hours I work at university for my university, I spend at work has reduced, just because I have to do other stuff which are important to and I can't avoid. And I often have this sense in my life, but also talking with colleagues, how structurally we are expected to spend a certain number of hours at work in a way that is not necessarily compatible with family life. And so I was wondering, so that's a person, I don't have a definite views on that, but it's definitely a narrative that comes back in my mind, that we are having issue of too many hours expected to be compatible with family life. And when we think of how important it is for men to feel able, performing, this kind of tension would naturally be quite impactful on our mental health. So I was wondering what your view on that is, and whether you have any advice to give.
I think I shared that, like you just said, that academia is probably not made for parenting. That resonates with me so much. I'm looking at Mark here, Mark and Arun probably, to see what you have to share with regards to this comment. Mark, you first, and then Arun, please.
Yeah, it's definitely something I encounter, and I suppose because I'm in a position of doing this type of research, I can try and do things a bit differently. I would say, I was thinking about how people can help change that. There are 2 strands, I suppose. There's the top down, where you can have people in positions of senior responsibility, role modeling, and being visible parents who have caring responsibilities and talk about it. And actually their actions being the most important thing. It's easy to talk about it, as we saw with Boris Johnson talking about changing nappies. Let's see some action to prove that you're doing something. But the other side of it, and something that I'm very passionate about, and I know Madiha knows this, is parents and carers networks getting together, and that being a way of generating a conversation, an ongoing conversation, and a presence within academia, certainly, something that people are aware of and that can influence. And the more you are collective and can speak to issues that are important to parents and carers, the more that discourse can start to change. And culture change is very slow. But what you're speaking to is the ideal worker paradigm, the way that people feel they have to be fully committed to the workplace, and academia can be very challenging for that, because the work doesn't end when you leave the building, or it's constantly there. So I think it's a very difficult challenge to overcome. But yeah, those are the two ways that I've always felt the culture change could happen, alongside what was already been discussed with Arun and Kevin with policy change. I think that's crucial, and charters as well.
Thanks, Mark. Arun, please, do you want to share some thoughts on this about academia being almost toxic?
Yeah, sure. So I'll share just a few things. I think institutions can do more. So quite quickly, institutions can start to review their parental leave policies already, and not just consult with their university community, but actually involve them in the conversation from design through to implementation. That requires a significant step change, I think, in the way of policy development in higher education more broadly. But I think it's really important, and I think universities can do that quite quickly, or they can start and prioritize that quite quickly. I think the second part, though, most importantly, is we recognise that the number of carers and caring related issues that impact staff experience, retention, success in universities is on the rise. So we need to start thinking about more agile, more responsive caring, actually specifically caring responsibility and caring leave policies for individuals as well. I think it needs to be, again, with the involvement of community of carers, not just consultation, because consultation can be quick, but can also be quite passive, right? So I think that's just something I think we need to be, those are two things universities can do now. And then I think those should be prioritized, because we need to improve staff experience, we need to improve staff retention and success as well more broadly. And these are some of the ways that can really help and assist that as well, to make that sense of belonging there too.
Thank you. And I think Richard has raised a really important point. What about the professional services staff? So academia is not only academics, right? It is the people who actually keep the show running. It's about professional services staff, like myself, for example. What about them? When we talk about academia, it's only academics, but actually that's not the total picture. The picture includes professional services as well. So this conversation is quickly becoming clear to me that 1 hour was not enough. But as I had promised you only 60 minutes, I'm very, very respectful of your time, everybody on the call today. These are really interesting conversations, and I think there is no magic trick or no kind of, a magic wand which I can wave today and, solve everything. But I think what this is, hopefully, it's the start of a conversation. I haven't seen many events around men's mental health in particular, and I know that many people here have shared lots of resources, and it looks like the conversation would like to continue. People would like to see more of this. So here's what I can promise you. I can promise you a recording of this session. And I can definitely promise you that going forward, we would strive to have more conversations like these, so that we can talk more openly about the different challenges that everyone and anyone has experienced. So I do want to stop here. I want to say a massive thanks to my 4 panelists. I want to give them an actual real clap. And I want to say thank you to all people who have joined today, who have made time today. And let's keep this conversation going. And I'll be in touch with more details. And have a lovely rest of the afternoon. And if at all, just one thing it is, look after yourselves and your mental health. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye now.